arrived in Hollow Glen without escort, wagon, or known kin. He wore no hat, no gloves, and bore only a leather-bound Bible and a satchel that clinked softly when he walked. Locals claimed he crossed the salted ridge barefoot, past lands known for wolves, and weather that unsettled even seasoned trappers. When asked why he came alone, he said only that the valley had called him. By midsummer, he had built a chapel using old cedar, pulled from a collapsed tannery, and plaster mixed with ash and lime scraped from the walls of abandoned smokehouses. He named it the Temple of the Vine. It had no bell, no cross, no steeple, just an open basin at the front of the sanctuary where water was never poured, only vinegar. And when questioned, he'd nod and whisper, "For memory must sour before it sweetens." Within weeks the faithful began arriving, by lantern, by dusk, in silence. Before we go any further, tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments below. The earliest congregants came from no farther than 30 miles, farmhands, widows, and a few former parishioners of shuttered chapels that had once dotted the highlands. They wore their Sunday coats, wrong side out, and brought offerings of salt pork, dried fruit, and vinegar steeped with herbs. The temple's rules were never written, but all seemed to understand: no laughter, no singing, and no bread unless it had been left to go stale. Corbin Yates taught that decay was divine, that the soul only ripened once the body began to fail. Infants were not baptized but anointed with bitter draughts. Corpses were not buried in caskets, but bound in linen and soaked with vinegar, then placed in pine hollows until their scent faded. Sermons began at dusk and ended before the first crows stirred, and none ever recalled hearing him shout. He whispered, and somehow everyone heard. Even those outside, standing in frost or rain, claimed the words found them anyway. By the winter of 1848, the Temple of the Vine had grown beyond its cedar walls. A second structure was raised beside it, narrower, windowless, and sunk 3 feet below the earth. They called it the Vine Cellar, though no wine was ever kept there, only bodies. At first, it was said to be a place for vigil, where the dead were watched for 3 nights before burial, in keeping with a Right Reverend Yates, called the Bitter Reckoning. But soon those nights turned to weeks, and then to months. Families brought their deceased to the cellar, not in mourning, but in expectation. They prayed not for peace, but for return. No name was carved in stone, no headstone ever raised. The dead were left in linen, steeped in vinegar, and laid among others, row after row, face to ceiling. The air grew sharp with acid and mildew, yet no one complained. When asked why, most gave the same answer: because some of them came back. The first so-called return was a boy named Elias Brandt, aged 9, who drowned in a flooded root cellar near Sparrow Creek. His mother Ruth refused burial and brought him to the Vine Cellar, wrapped in horse blanketing and soaked in vinegar tincture made with wintergreen. 3 nights passed, then 10. On the 11th she claimed he stirred. She unwrapped him before the congregation and whispered her son's name. Witnesses said his eyes fluttered and his lips parted. Others insisted they saw breath, faint, sour, but unmistakable. The boy did not speak for days, and when he did, it was not in his mother's voice. He quoted verses no one recalled reading. He named herbs by their Latin root. He said the ground beneath the cellar was sweet with memory, and pointed to a far wall, where a set of bones never catalogued would later be found behind a bricked alcove. After that, others began to arrive with vinegar jugs and limp bodies in tow. Not all returns were gentle. In the early thaw of 1849, a farmer named Deke Lothrop brought his sister Miriam to the Vine Cellar. She had died from lockjaw, her limbs twisted and mouth frozen wide. Deke arrived alone, pale from lack of sleep, and carrying her in a cart meant for timber. He said she had whispered to him from the smokehouse where her body lay, that she had told him to fetch the old vinegar from their father's cider barrels. The congregation hesitated. Miriam had been known for blasphemy. She had mocked Reverend Yates and refused communion more than once. But Yates permitted the ritual. She was wrapped, steeped, and laid beneath the cellar's centre beam. For 3 days, nothing changed. On the 4th, moaning began. On the 5th, her hands unfurled. But her face never softened. Her jaw remained locked. When she rose, her breath reeked of spoiled cloves. And she wouldn't speak, not to her brother, not to anyone. She simply pointed to the chapel's basin, and they refilled it, twice. Over time, the congregation began to adopt strange habits outside the chapel. Homes bore no mirrors. Water was boiled before use, even in winter, and left to cool in glass jars beside doorways, to catch memory, they said. No one sang, not even to children. Instead, families whispered psalms into vinegar jars, sealing them with wax and storing them beneath floorboards. A woman named Esther Flint wove black veils for newborns, claiming the sight of their own reflection could undo the reckoning. Livestock were rarely slaughtered. When they were, tongues were removed first and buried near the vine cellar steps. One man, an apothecary, who once brewed tonic in town, began crafting tinctures he called soul binders, vinegar steeped with roots, chalk dust and filings from an old church bell. People paid with relics, baby teeth, prayer stones, fragments of old hymnals. They said the drink dulled grief, but some took too much, and when they spoke, their words seemed borrowed, too old, too slow, as if memory itself had begun to answer. By autumn of that same year, the hills surrounding Hollow Glen began to empty. Hunters abandoned cabins, and old family plots stood unvisited. Roads that once led to the county line turned inward instead, toward the temple, toward the basin. Even those who never joined the congregation kept vinegar jars near their hearths and salted their porches as a precaution. The local magistrate, a man named Ilham Rusk, sent 2 men to survey the chapel grounds. Neither returned. Days later, their horses arrived riderless, eyes wild and hooves cracked as if they'd been running for days. Their saddlebags contained only one thing: folded pages torn from different family Bibles, each passage underlined. No 2 verses matched. One spoke of Ezekiel's vision, another of Lazarus, a third warned of the bitter cup. No explanation followed. Reverend Yates, when told of it, merely smiled and said, "Even vinegar needs time to steep." The phrase spread through the valley like mildew on stone, quiet, slow, and permanent. The final sign came not from within the chapel, but from beneath it. One evening in late November, the floorboards of the vine cellar began to warp. Those tending to the dead noticed a sound beneath the planks, a slow, rhythmic knocking, like wood swelling against stone. Some claimed it matched the cadence of a sermon. Others said it mimicked a heartbeat. Reverend Yates did not speak for 3 days. He fasted, drank nothing but vinegar, steeped with rosehip and ash, and lay flat upon the cellar floor. On the 3rd night, he rose and addressed the congregation with red-rimmed eyes and cracked lips. "The soil remembers," he said. "It has tasted enough sweetness. Now, it wants the bitter." That night, a new rite was introduced. The binding cup, a shared draught passed mouth to mouth, thick with curdled herbs, sipped in complete silence. And those who drank claimed they dreamt of rooms with no corners, voices behind their eyes, and footsteps echoing upward from below. Spring brought no thaw to Hollow Glen. The ground remained firm, unyielding, as if the frost had rooted deeper than nature allowed. Children stopped being born. Pregnancies, once carried in secret behind shuttered curtains, now ended in silence. No blood, no pain, just absence. Midwives reported empty wombs where there had once been life. One woman, Mercy Dolan, claimed she awoke to find her child missing not from her arms, but from inside her. The townsfolk spoke in whispers of a new term, the unbirth, and behind closed doors, they began to suspect it was not punishment, but trade. The dead were returning, yes, but something else was being taken in return. Something young, something pure. On the chapel wall, a new phrase appeared, painted in dark brine: "That which is unborn may still be remembered." No one saw who wrote it. No one removed it, and when it faded, it left no stain, just a faint smell of rot and rosemary that lingered for weeks. A traveller named Jonah Meeks arrived that June, his boots coated in road dust, and his eyes too alert for a man of his age. He said he was a circuit preacher from Calhoun County, come to offer support in a time of spiritual confusion. But he refused to enter the chapel, and when invited to the binding cup, he declined with a firm shake of his head. "That's not wine," he muttered. "That's preservation." Jonah rented a room above the abandoned Grange Hall, and took to sketching maps at night of the chapel, the vine cellar, and the unmarked plots surrounding both. He carried a pouch of crushed anise and clove, which he kept pressed to his face whenever the wind changed. Those who passed him on the road said he looked haunted, like someone listening to a tune no one else could hear. By the end of the month, he was gone, but his room held a single phrase, carved into the underside of the windowsill. "The vinegar is not for the body, it's for what wears it." That summer, parishioners began to lose time. Whole afternoons vanished. Men would find themselves standing knee-deep in creeks, with no memory of leaving their beds. Women woke to find vinegar jars uncorked and empty at their feet, their mouths dry and stained brown. One boy, Elijah Frost, was found barefoot in the chapel at dawn, mumbling in a tongue no one recognized. His fingers were puckered and wrinkled, as if he'd been submerged for days. He had not been seen in over a week. His mother claimed she'd buried him the previous autumn, and had visited his grave each Sunday since. But when they dug, there was nothing beneath the stone, no bones, no shroud, not even disturbed earth. The stone itself was blank on its underside, as though never intended to mark anything at all. That week, more graves were opened. Many were found hollow, others were wet inside, despite no rain, and in the corners of the vine cellar, flies gathered, not around the dead, but around the living. That summer, parishioners began to lose time. Whole afternoons vanished. Men would find themselves standing knee-deep in creeks, with no memory of leaving their beds. Women woke to find vinegar jars uncorked and empty at their feet, their mouths dry and stained brown. One boy, Elijah Frost, was found barefoot in the chapel at dawn, mumbling in a tongue no one recognized. His fingers were puckered and wrinkled, as if he'd been submerged for days. He had not been seen in over a week. His mother claimed she'd buried him the previous autumn, and had visited his grave each Sunday since. But when they dug, there was nothing beneath the stone, no bones, no shroud, not even disturbed earth. The stone itself was blank on its underside, as though never intended to mark anything at all. That week, more graves were opened. Many were found hollow, others were wet inside, despite no rain, and in the corners of the vine cellar, flies gathered, not around the dead, but around the living. In the woods west of the vine cellar, a trail was discovered, not new, but newly noticed. It was narrow, flanked by elder trees, and lined with empty vinegar jugs, half buried in moss. No one admitted to placing them. The path curved sharply, and descended into a shallow hollow, where no birds ever sang. At its end stood a structure half swallowed by the earth, roofless and slick with sap. Locals called it the second mouth. It resembled a chapel, only in shape. No doors, no altar, just an open floor of warped wood stained black. Reverend Yates never spoke of it, but parishioners began disappearing for hours at a time, returning with damp clothes and glazed eyes. Some brought small offerings, childhood trinkets, broken glasses, locks of hair tied with thread, and left them at the threshold. One night, a girl was seen dragging her own shadow behind her, unnaturally slow, as if it resisted. The next morning, she was gone. In her place, a full jug at the chapel steps, corked and warm to the touch. By mid-September, the language of the congregation began to shift. Words lengthened, simple phrases turned dense and uneven, filled with pauses when none were needed. Children muttered sentences backwards in their sleep. A hymn book left open on a pew was found with ink bleeding upward into the paper, forming verses that echoed Yeats's early sermons, ones no one remembered him writing down. At town gatherings, former parishioners would sit in silence, eyes unfocused, as though waiting for someone to speak first. But when someone did, they'd all turn at once. One man, Elias Boone, returned to his farm after a full week missing, holding a jug clutched to his chest like an infant. He'd cut off all his fingers. It was too loud, he said. The sweetness was getting in. He died within the hour, mouth full of vinegar, teeth dissolved into soft pulp. No one claimed the body. That night, Reverend Yates placed a new basin outside the temple, larger, deeper. They called it the memory vat. It was never emptied, and no insects came near it. The crops in Hollow Glen began to rot from the inside. Apples collapsed into brown slush, while still on the tree. Corn split down the stalks, revealing kernels that bled a thin black fluid with the smell of turned cider. Even the pumpkins, once hollowed for the autumn rites, sagged before the harvest moon rose. Yet the congregation did not panic. Instead, they began to fast. Reverend Yates preached that rot was revelation, that the spoiled fruit carried messages that sweetness concealed. He held sermons beside dying orchards, where he dipped withered pears into vinegar and passed them, one by one, through the crowd. Those who partook claimed visions, corridors of salt-brined stone, glass windows that wept, voices calling from behind walls where no room had ever stood. A boy named Tobias spoke of seeing his own father inside a jug, curled like an infant, whispering the word return again and again. After that, the orchard was renamed the Mouth's Tongue, and no one walked it without bare feet and silence. Even the wind avoided it. On the final day of October, under a moon that flickered like flame through cloud-thin mist, the congregation held what came to be known only as the Sour Vigil. No summons had been sent. No words were spoken, yet every soul from Hollow Glen and the outlying farms gathered in the vine cellar, faces pale, hands empty. The binding cup was not offered. Instead, a basin larger than any before, shallow, circular, with carvings of fruit in decay, was filled with vinegar, dark as ink. Reverend Yates removed his boots and stepped in barefoot. He did not speak. He simply stood, eyes closed, arms open. The air grew cold, the cellar walls slick with condensation. Someone began humming, a low, tuneless sound, and others joined until the space pulsed with a rhythm older than song. Those who watched swore the liquid rose up around Yates' calves without rippling, and when it stilled, something within the vinegar shifted, pressing upward, just beneath the surface. Like a face caught behind glass, it smiled, not at Yates, at them. After the vigil, the chapel doors no longer closed. They hung slightly ajar, swollen from damp and warped at the hinges, as though the wood itself resisted being sealed. No one touched them. The congregation began sleeping in shifts, some beneath the pews, others in the orchard, whispering into jars, or tracing unseen shapes into the earth. Children were no longer seen during the day. Their laughter, once heard faintly near the creek or behind barns, was replaced by the sound of jars clinking in the dark. An old woman named June Halver, who had refused the binding cup for nearly 2 years, was found standing in the basin at dawn, eyes rolled back, mouthing names no one recognized. Her body was cold, but her mouth was warm. The vinegar had not preserved her, it had claimed her. Afterward, her house burned itself to the foundation, without spark or storm. Her neighbors said nothing. They only left 2 jugs on the ashes, each uncorked, each filled with air that smelled of peaches long rotted. A hush fell over Hollow Glen in the weeks that followed, not from fear but from expectation, the kind that settles before thunder. No dogs barked, no roosters called, and when the wind did come, it carried not dust nor seed, but the sharp tang of vinegar, so thick it stung the eyes and coated the tongue. The living moved slower. Even the old men at the crossroads post stopped their card games, sitting instead in rigid silence, with hands folded and backs too straight. Inside the vine cellar, the arrangement of the bodies changed. Those who had once lain in rows were now propped along the walls, upright and cloaked in soaked linen, like statues caught mid-procession. No one admitted to moving them. No one questioned it. In the center, beneath the memory vat, someone placed a wooden cradle. It was too small for any of the dead. It held no child, only a single blackened tooth, wrapped in red wool. When asked, Yates responded simply, "The mouth does not close until it's fed." The writings began soon after, scrawled in soot beneath windowsills, etched into door frames with bone, painted in sour mash along fence posts. Always the same refrain: what was sweet is taken, what is bitter remains. Some were found inside old vinegar jugs, the words curling upward along the glass from within, written backward, as if meant to be read from the other side. A girl named Cassie Holt, mute since birth, was seen drawing symbols into the dirt behind the chapel, using only her feet. When her mother called her name, the girl turned, opened her mouth, and out poured a thin stream of cloudy liquid. She smiled, then collapsed. The ground beneath her soaked it in. The next day, the field behind the chapel bloomed with pale white fruit, pear-shaped, translucent, and cold to the touch. No birds came near them. A boy plucked one and bit down. He did not speak again. He only pointed at the vine cellar, and mouthed one word again and again: listen. By December, snowfall refused to settle near the chapel. It fell like ash, then vanished, leaving only wet stone and the scent of ferment. A visiting tinsmith from Ridge Hollow, unaware of local rites, offered to repair the warped chapel door. He was never seen again. His cart was found beside the road 2 days later, wheels sunk in mud, tools rusted in place. Inside the wagon lay a single jug, sealed with wax, marked with the shape of an open mouth, carved into the side. When opened, it held no vinegar, only fog. And within that fog, a faint whisper, a voice not of warning, but invitation. That week, Reverend Yates began preaching not of resurrection, but of exchange. The soul has weight, he said. Memory is matter. He claimed the vine cellar was now a threshold, not a place to preserve, but a place to pass through. That night, 7 congregants drank from the vat directly. Their mouths blackened, their eyes went pale, and when dawn came, they were gone. But their clothes remained, folded, dry, and still warm. The winter deepened, but hunger vanished. Fields lay barren, livestock bones stacked in neat piles beside sheds. But no one complained of hunger pains. It was said the binding cup nourished more than flesh. Some swore that once they drank enough, they could hear their own memories speaking back, not as echoes, but as instruction. One man, Milton Gresh, claimed he remembered being born not from a mother, but from a vat. He said the first scent he knew was vinegar and wood smoke. His family locked him in the hayloft that night. By morning he had vanished. Only a trail of pale footprints remained, bare, wet, leading to the orchard, then stopping where the earth had gone soft. The footprints did not sink. They rested on the surface, as if left by someone too light to belong fully to this world. That same day, the river ran backward for 6 hours. The fish floated belly up, but did not rot. Their mouths hung open. All faced inland, toward the temple. In early January, the pulpit was removed. No explanation was given. In its place stood a tall, narrow frame of elderwood, bound with copper wire, something between a doorway and a gallows, though no rope ever hung from it. Reverend Yates stood beside it at every gathering, one hand resting gently against the grain, his eyes never blinking during the rites. He stopped speaking entirely. Instead, the congregation read from jars, slips of vellum, rolled and sealed, pulled from vinegar vessels, and recited aloud, each voice growing weaker the longer it read. Some collapsed before finishing. One boy coughed blood into the vat and smiled. The frame began to hum faintly during these sessions, and those nearest claimed the air around it blurred, like heat rising from stone. No one walked through it. Not yet, but one night, the shadow of a woman was seen on the far side, tall, veiled, holding something swaddled. When a man reached for her, his hand burned. The skin blistered into the shape of a pear. It did not fade, nor did he ever sleep again. When the thaw finally came, it touched every part of Hollow Glen, except the cellar. The soil remained hard. The air inside stayed cool, sharp with the bite of acid and rot, and still the congregation gathered. A silence deeper than prayer had settled over them, as if language itself no longer served. They brought no offerings. They brought themselves. One by one they stepped barefoot into the basin, knelt, and submerged their faces. Some emerged sobbing, others, still. One woman did not rise. Her body was pulled free, limp and breathless, but her mouth was open wide and smiling. Her tongue was missing. Reverend Yates only watched. Behind him, the frame of elderwood darkened, copper tarnished to green. And then, in full daylight, the figure returned, a woman as before but now closer. Her veil was soaked. Beneath it, her face was featureless. In her arms, what she carried shifted. It breathed. The congregation did not scream. They knelt, and one by one they began to hum, low, sour, without melody, like the start of something just beginning to decay. By the end of February, maps stopped marking Hollow Glen. Travellers who passed through found their compasses lagged. Their watches slowed. Mail no longer arrived. When letters were sent, they returned unopened. The ink bloomed into unreadable shapes, as if the words had soured. Those few outsiders who came on foot described the valley as too quiet, the sky above it dimmer, as though light there had weight. One cartographer, who sketched the glen from a hillside, reported a strange occurrence. The chapel, drawn carefully in charcoal, slowly began to blur on the page. The outline bent inward, the spire vanished. When he returned to camp, he found his hands stained with vinegar, and could not recall drawing at all. Within the temple, the basin had grown wider. No one remembered building it. The elderwood frame stood taller now, warped at its corners, and through it, that figure faceless, always wet. Sometimes she nodded. Sometimes she cradled what looked like a bundle. Sometimes, nothing at all. But always she waited. And behind her, the walls glistened, as if breathing, as if remembering. When the snows finally withdrew from Hollow Glen, they left behind not mud nor thawed roots, but a pale residue that clung to the grass like wax. No one dared touch it. The earth beneath remained cold, unnaturally so. And when hooves met soil, the horses flinched, as though stepping on something that breathed just below. Those who'd remained in the town, those who had not walked through the elderwood frame, nor vanished beneath the vine cellar, no longer called themselves by name. The old ways of address fell away. They referred to each other by gestures, or titles that changed depending on the time of day. Morning Mouth, Third Watcher, Keeper of the Drain. No one corrected anyone. Language had turned to vinegar, once familiar, now puckered and harsh. The frame had grown, that much was certain. Its copper bindings spread like veins, crawling out into the floorboards, branching up the walls in erratic, breath-like patterns. Those who sat before it each night did so with open palms and closed eyes. They did not pray, they listened. Sometimes they wept, other times they rose and walked backwards through the orchard paths, whispering to trees that had never borne fruit. Reverend Yates no longer preached. He had taken up residence beside the basin, now grown so wide it filled half the chapel floor. The memory vat, they called it, though none recalled giving it that name. Within its depths, the vinegar had thickened into something darker. It gave off no steam, and when stirred, it did not ripple. Instead, it absorbed movement, as though hungry. That spring, a man arrived from Cattail Creek, sent by a distant cousin, who had not heard from his kin in nearly a year. His name was Ephraim Locke. He wore a wool coat, a hunter's knife at his belt, and a folded paper map smoothed flat in his coat's inner pocket. No one greeted him. No one offered him a place to stay. He found the town altered in ways that maps could not describe. Houses reoriented slightly eastward, window panes removed and replaced with stretched cloth soaked in brine, roads now curving where they once ran straight. At the general store, he found no register, no coin box, only a basin filled with dried petals and teeth. A girl behind the counter handed him a jar, without asking his name. Inside, a paper slip soaked through, ink still bleeding. One word remained clear: remain. He did not. That night, Ephraim made camp outside the orchard line. He would leave at dawn, he told himself. But in the morning, his boots were missing. So was his map. His horse stood motionless, breathing shallow, facing the chapel. Its eyes were black, not from fear, but reverence. Ephraim never left Hollow Glen. His name was never spoken again. Yet weeks later, a jug was placed beside the memory vat. Inside it, wrapped in birch bark and soaked through, lay the map. The ink redrawn, the roads removed. Only the frame remained, labeled not as a structure, but as a mouth, open, waiting. It was during the third week of thaw that the cellar ceiling began to weep, not moisture from soil or spring rain. This was thicker, sour, tinged with iron. It dripped from the rafters in slow, metered pulses, striking the stone floor with the rhythm of breath. Those who tended the vine cellar said nothing. They laid linen beneath the drops. They collected it in glass vials and returned it to the basin by dusk. When asked what the substance was, an old man who had once been the schoolmaster replied, "It's remembrance, a steeped one." His eyes had gone grey. He spoke only in past tense, as though he no longer participated in the present. That same week, the children returned. No one saw where they came from. They were not led. They did not speak. They simply walked barefoot through the orchard at dawn, hair wet, clothes colourless, eyes dark with absence. Their parents did not rush to embrace them. They only nodded, as if this had always been expected. Each child carried something small: buttons, thimbles, scraps of parchment folded into tight squares, offerings. They placed these at the foot of the elderwood frame. In return, the figure beyond the threshold stepped closer. Her veil remained, but now her hands were visible. Long, pale fingers slick with a shine that never dried. She did not beckon. She didn't need to. Those who dreamed began waking with vinegar in their mouths. They described the same vision: a long table beneath the soil, set not with food, but with items from the living. Hair combs, doll heads, eyeglasses without lenses. The dead sat at this table, but they did not eat. They whispered into the objects. They placed memories into them like messages into bottles, and one by one, the items were passed back, upward, through root and stone and water, to the chapel above, a place where the living would one day receive them again. On the last Sunday before planting season, the congregation gathered barefoot in the field. No crops had grown there in years, yet now, tiny shoots had appeared, pale green, but sharp at the ends. They did not sway in the breeze. They stood rigid, humming faintly if one placed an ear to the ground. Reverend Yates knelt before them and poured vinegar over the soil. He did not bless it. He simply whispered, "What returns is not what was lost, but it knows your name." That night, 13 jugs were placed along the chapel steps. Each bore a name carved not into glass, but into the dried skin of fruit stitched over the mouth. When the wind blew, the jugs rattled. The sound was not hollow. It echoed with something that pulsed. Not quite a voice, not quite a beat, a knowing. The jugs remained for 3 days. Then they vanished. In their place stood 13 pairs of boots, polished, empty, all facing east, toward the orchard, toward the frame, toward the bitter path ahead. By the time April arrived, no one in Hollow Glen kept time. Clocks had been removed from mantles. Wrist watches, once handed down between generations, were boiled in brine and left at the base of trees in the orchard, ticking faintly as the vinegar dissolved their gears. Day and night blended together. Candles burned in daylight, and windows remained shuttered, regardless of the hour. What mattered now was timing, not as a measure, but as an offering. Certain acts could only be performed during the still hours, when the air inside the chapel was thick enough to catch breath and turn it sour. The congregation moved in patterns, turning in unison when they entered the temple, pausing at doorways for unseen signals, never stepping on the same stone twice, if it could be helped. Ritual replaced routine, memory replaced will. The elderwood frame had changed again. Its corners, once bent from weather and wire, now shimmered with something not quite light. The copper no longer dulled. It pulsed faintly with a greenish hue, like oxidized bone come to life. The figure beyond the threshold no longer waited at its center. She had begun to drift, circling the edges of her own unseen room, leaving behind trails of something wet. Wherever she walked, the veil moved without wind. Her bundle still pulsed, but now made sound. A low, infant-like coo that ended always in a rattle, like teeth in a jar. Some believed it was her child, others insisted it was not a child at all. But the distilled sorrow of the town made flesh, a grief so old it had taken form. That month, 3 men from outside the glen attempted to breach the chapel. They carried with them rifles, salt packs, and a letter of intent signed by a county judge. They were never seen again, but the next morning, 3 new lanterns appeared inside the vine cellar, each lit with a cold flame, each hanging above a place on the wall where the dead did not rest. Beneath them, empty linen wraps folded with precision. On the cloths, strands of hair, all the same length, tied with copper wire. The message was clear. Entry was not forbidden. It was simply not survivable. The orchard bloomed again, not with fruit, but with vessels. Glass grew from branches. It began as soft bulbs, then hardened in the night into clear, jug-shaped forms, filled halfway with pale vinegar and fragments of paper. Children were assigned to harvest them, never touching the glass directly. They wore linen gloves soaked in ash and rainwater. Each jug was carried into the chapel and placed in a ring around the memory vat. Once set, none were opened. Not even Reverend Yates approached them. They sat like eyes, watching, and over time, the air in the chapel shifted. It smelled no longer of vinegar or brine, but of parchment and breath, of stories steeped too long, of memory that had forgotten its beginning, but still remembered its weight. The last letter ever mailed from Hollow Glen arrived in a neighboring village on a windless Tuesday, slipped beneath the church doors with no return address. It bore no postage, only a black wax seal imprinted with a single impression, the outline of a pear rotted through at the center. The paper inside was brittle, edges curled from damp, but the ink remained sharp. It read, "We have stopped counting. The mouth has no calendar. Its seasons are of flesh and rot. We are not lost, we are steeped." Beneath the writing, a single strand of grey hair was pressed between layers of wax paper. It smelled faintly of cloves and iron. The letter was never answered. No one in the village spoke of it again. By then, the elderwood frame no longer pulsed alone. Behind it, the room it revealed had shifted. What was once a void, with only the veiled woman and her bundle, now bore signs of furniture: low wooden tables, stone shelves, rows of shallow bowls filled with dark liquid that did not reflect. Sometimes, faint shapes moved along the walls, silhouettes of hands, faces, or things with no clear outline at all. The woman still cradled her burden, but it no longer pulsed in rhythm. It throbbed irregularly, like something wounded, something remembering too much. She no longer stood still. She paced, and her pacing wore grooves into the floor behind her. Grooves that glistened, that frothed when she stepped through them. The townsfolk spoke less and less. They communicated now through arrangement, of jugs, of shoes, of branches nailed to thresholds, in patterns that recalled old farm symbols, yet always slightly altered. A boot turned east beside a jug meant danger. A spoon resting atop a cradle meant a child had returned, but without its tongue. At the edge of town, wind chimes were constructed from items soaked in vinegar: buttons, teeth, infant bells once sewn into children's shoes. When the wind blew, they rang in minor chords. The sound was not beautiful. It was remembering something too loudly. Reverend Yates, no longer aged. His skin had taken on a parchment tone, and when he moved, it seemed more gesture than motion, like he remembered how to walk, but had stopped relying on muscles to do it. He sat each day beside the memory vat, whispering into its depths. His voice never echoed, but sometimes, the liquid responded with a tremble. The townspeople gathered around him silently, waiting not for instruction, but for confirmation, that they were still beneath the mouth's favor, that their bitterness had been accepted. When he paused, they wept, not from fear, but from relief. That night, A child was born without eyes, but with a full set of adult teeth. It never cried, only clicked its jaws softly, until the morning. They named it second fruit. They placed it in a jug of warmed brine. By sunrise, the liquid inside had turned black, but the child remained warm, watching, waiting. Spring never fully returned to Hollow Glen that year. The air remained thick, damp, with something that wasn't quite fog and wasn't quite breath. Grass turned translucent. Bark split down the trunks of trees, revealing pulpy veins that glistened in moonlight. The orchard bore no blossoms, only the glass fruits, more of them now, ripening overnight with strange precision. Each vessel, when shaken, made a sound like something whispering underwater. No one dared open them. Instead, the children were taught to weigh each jug by hand, to catalogue them by density and tone, not by sight. They stored them in the root cellar beneath the chapel, now renamed the First Belly. Those who entered it described a pressure behind the eyes, a scent like old pages left in vinegar, a sensation that something beneath the ground was listening to them breathe. One night, without announcement, a procession began. The townspeople rose in the dark and walked barefoot to the chapel, carrying bundles of cloth tied with human hair. Inside each, teeth, mostly baby teeth, though some were too large to be mistaken as such. They laid them one by one before the elderwood frame, which now arched slightly forward, as if leaning into the room. The veiled figure behind it had stopped pacing. She stood dead still, her head bowed, her burden gone. In its place, her arms were crossed over her chest. What she held now was not visible, but her shape was different. Broader, sharpened at the joints, taller by inches. When a child approached the frame and knelt, she raised her head for the first time. Beneath the veil, there was only a smear of color, no face, no expression, only the implication of sight. The child reached forward and began to hum. By morning the child was gone, but a new vine had begun to grow from the threshold. It was black, thick as rope, and it curled in on itself like a noose. It smelled of salt and bile. The congregation named it the tongue. They tended it gently, whispering old psalms into its coils. Reverend Yates said nothing. He had not spoken in weeks, but his hands, once folded in prayer, now moved constantly, making signs, tracing circles in the air, cupping nothing, lifting invisible weights. He stood only when the tongue twitched. The town bell was removed from its tower and laid into the orchard, buried upright, so that only its crown protruded. It was filled with brined cloth, then sealed with wax. No one rang it, but some nights it rang on its own, deep, dull, the sound of a throat closing. The memory vat was no longer vinegar. Its contents had thickened into something black and smooth, without scent, without reflection. When disturbed, it did not splash. It swallowed, and once when a young man dropped a candle in by accident, he looked in after it and screamed. He did not stop. Not when they pulled him away, not when his mouth filled with blood, not until they poured the old vinegar down his throat. Then silence. Grateful, hollow, complete. In the final days of planting season, the chapel floor began to rise, not from water, nor from quake, but as if the ground itself had started breathing. Boards lifted by fractions each night, subtle at first, then undeniable. Nails wept rust. Beneath the planks, something pulsed. Reverend Yates stood above it, with arms outstretched, palms downward, as if pressing back against a surface, trying to uncoil. The congregation circled him in silence, each bearing a jug of the old vinegar, now considered too pure for drinking. It was said to have memory in its rawest form, before steeping, before intention. They poured it onto the floor, into cracks where the light no longer reached, and whispered the same phrase over and over. Seal the fruit, bind the breath, let no sweetness wake. The town itself leaned inward. Roofs sagged toward the chapel. Windows reflected not the street, but the orchard, even when facing west. Animals ceased making noise altogether. The hens laid dry shells. Goats gave no milk. Even the dogs, once kept for warning, now sat quietly in the corners of their owners' homes, facing the same direction. The frame, the woman behind it, no longer moved. She had taken root, her veil stretching downward like moss, sinking into the stone beneath her feet. From her chest grew new vines, thinner than the tongue, but twitching, always searching, tasting the air. One wound its way through the frame's bottom, and crossed into the chapel. No one dared cut it. They simply built a bowl around it, filled with vinegar and bone dust, and called it the mouth's first word. That Sunday, the townspeople gathered in full darkness. Candles were not lit. Instead, each person held a jar filled with glistening oil, and a single breath, captured by holding one's mouth to the lip of the vessel, and exhaling slow. These jars were arranged in rows before the memory vat, forming a path toward the frame. At the end of that path, a cradle was placed. No child lay in it, only cloth, wet, sour, pulsing faintly, as if it remembered being a child, but had since outgrown the need for a name. Reverend Yates approached the cradle and knelt, not in worship, but in apology. He laid his head beside the cloth and closed his eyes. The room trembled, not loudly, but with the weight of a long-held breath finally released. When the tremor ceased, Yates remained motionless. At dawn the congregation found him still kneeling. His body was intact, but the flesh from his face had peeled clean, revealing nothing beneath but smooth white bone, dry as paper, and shaped into a calm smile. No insects came near, no odor followed. They buried his remains not in the earth, but within the memory vat itself. The liquid accepted him without sound, and that night, the tongue vine at the altar curled into the shape of his initials. The congregation did not mourn, they only listened, because from beneath the floor came something new, not a breath, not a beat, but a voice, trying to remember its first word. By the first days of June, Hollow Glen no longer held itself to the rules of the world beyond. The sky remained the same shade of dim, neither full day nor full night, a dull canvas through which no sun nor star could pierce. Crops ceased trying, soil turned sour, trees bore not leaves but soft, translucent sacks that sagged with moisture and burst with a smell no one dared describe aloud. Those who still called themselves congregants moved through the town in pairs, bound by twine soaked in vinegar, each pair tethered at the wrist, and tasked with silent circuits around the vine cellar at dusk. No one spoke during the watch. It was said that words, when uttered carelessly in the waning light, could be heard too clearly beneath the floorboards, and whatever listened down there had begun to answer back, not in sound, but in memory. The memory vat now required constant tending. Its surface hardened at the edges each morning, flaking away like old parchment, while the center remained soft, warm, and gently pulsing. It consumed more each day. Old hymnals, baptismal records, bundles of hair wrapped in linen, even prayer benches. Nothing floated, nothing returned. It was said that a name whispered into the vat's rim would vanish from paper and recollection alike. The price of forgetting was not grief, it was hunger. Once forgotten, the soul needed to be replaced, and so they began writing new names, offering them up on slips of salted vellum. Mercy, Writhe, June Path, the Younger Mouth, Bitterkin. The names did not belong to anyone, not yet, but the vat accepted them. The frame, now nearly merged with the chapel wall, had split its own shape. A second frame, smaller, thinner, with edges bound in blackened copper, had begun to bloom beside it like a sibling vine. No figure moved behind this second frame, only water, deep, green-black, with the occasional glint of something swimming past, too fast, too large. The congregation began to prepare for the exchange. They did not call it that aloud, but in the arrangement of offerings, the shape of their prayers, it was understood, something would come through, and something would be given in return. That something had no name, only the outline of a shape in everyone's sleep, the same shape, drawn in frost on windows and echoed in vinegar rings on chapel stone. A head, a torso, too many arms. On the night of the longest watch, a child emerged from the vine cellar. No one had seen her before. She bore no family resemblance. She was soaked in brine, her hair plastered to her skull, her eyes clouded with white. She said nothing, but in her hand she carried a tooth, longer than any human's, curved like a fishhook, smooth as ivory. She placed it in the offering bowl before the frame, and knelt beside it. The vines behind the altar twisted once and lay still. The figure in the original frame opened her arms, but she no longer carried a bundle. Now she held a key, and the child smiled, though her mouth was full of rot. In the nights that followed, the townsfolk stopped sleeping. It wasn't resistance, it was removal. Sleep as it had once existed in Hollow Glen became something foreign. Beds were stripped, mattresses buried. Children were taught to blink with purpose, to count the rhythm of their eyelids against the floorboards, lest they drift. For dreams had begun to echo, and what came back from them was not recollection but residue. Fingers smelled of brine upon waking. Teeth ached with pressure, though none had loosened. Some opened their eyes to find black rings circling the corners of their rooms, perfect, slick, still wet. The mouth, it was said, had begun marking what it meant to take next. The second frame swelled by inches each night. Its glass-like surface now held not just water but depth, the kind that darkened at its center, like a well without bottom. Shapes moved within it, slender, jointless, always drifting sideways, always circling. They left trails, smears against a window no one had cleaned. The children called them tonguefish, though no one knew where the term had begun. The older folk simply watched and waited, eyes fixed on the shifting light behind the pane, lips parted, listening. Some began to speak in unison, low phrases, fractured, overlapping, not prayers, not language, but something deeper, remembered. The veiled woman behind the first frame no longer turned her head. Her arms stayed outstretched, not in invitation, but in insistence. Her fingers now split at the ends, blooming open like wet fruit. From her palms grew thin vines tipped in copper buds that trembled when a name was spoken nearby. These buds tracked motion, following the breath of passers-by, turning slowly in their sockets. They did not bloom, they did not close, they only waited. A new structure was built behind the chapel, dug into the hillside, where the orchard's roots no longer took. They called it the jar house. It had no door, only slits cut into the stone where jars were slid inward, and received no more. These jars, once filled with brine and teeth, now bore ink, pages written by unseen hands, sentences that rearranged themselves upon rereading. One message stayed constant across every vessel: he is not gone, he is steeped. Many believed it referred to Reverend Yates. Others said it was older, a name that never lived but always lingered. The vat behind the altar now bore his silhouette, not in substance, but in vacancy. The liquid recoiled from his shape. At twilight a boy disappeared between frames. He had been standing still, holding a jug filled with nothing but breath. One moment he was there, blinking, swaying. The next, gone. No splash, no scream, just absence. His sister began to hum immediately, a tune no one recognized, though many joined in. By morning she too was gone, but the jug remained. Inside it, no air, no breath, only a single line scratched into the glass from within. Sweetness sinks, bitterness floats, and the water behind the second frame shimmered, as if stirred, as if fed. By midsummer, the ground in Hollow Glen no longer held firm. It quivered slightly beneath each step, as though hollowed by some great internal shifting. The chapel floor, once built of thick-cut cedar, began to bow, not from rot, not from weight, but from surrender. It tilted gently toward the elderwood frame, so subtly at first that no one remarked on it aloud. But as the weeks passed, congregants adjusted their gait without thinking, leaning forward slightly as they walked, heads lowered, as though moving across the deck of a ship caught in slow descent. No one slipped, no one stumbled. The movement had become natural, expected, like gravity remembering something it had once promised to take. The figure behind the original frame had changed again. Her veil had thinned, not torn, but worn nearly translucent, like skin soaked too long in brine. Through it, glimpses of her face flickered with movement, not her own. The mouth remained still, a gentle curve, but the flesh behind it swam, features not static but rotating, unfolding, retreating. One eye blinked, then two, then none. What she held in her hands was now plainly visible, a thread, copper-colored, long enough to reach the floor, wet at both ends. It was not offered, it simply dangled, and the townspeople began to bring items to match it. Wedding rings, hairpins, bones no longer claimed by any living family. They tied these to the thread in silence. Each morning, the thread had retracted slightly, heavier. Behind the second frame, the water no longer shimmered. It churned, slowly, thickly, as if stirred from below by something massive, something waking with purpose. Occasionally faces appeared at its surface, not clearly, not fully, just the suggestion of shape, cheekbones too wide, mouths without lips, skin like blanched leather. The faces never rose far, and never stayed long, but when they left bubbles. Each bubble rose to the surface, and popped without sound. Afterward the room smelled briefly of blood, of iron, of something opened that should have remained sealed. The jar house overflowed, no longer able to contain the influx. The congregants began stringing the jars in lines from the chapel to the orchard, suspending them by twine above the path. Each jar held a different liquid, now amber, red, black, even a glowing pale green that pulsed when the wind passed. Some believed they had begun to dream through the jars, that memory was no longer trapped in the mind, but suspended, pickled, and stored like organs in a cabinet. They said old sins could be drowned this way, and new ones could be born clean. When the first of the black fruit fell from the vine behind the altar, it made no sound upon hitting the floor. It bounced once, then split, not with juice, but with steam, hot and sour, curling like smoke from a burned page. Inside was no seed, only pulp shaped like a keyhole. That night the second frame flickered. For the first time something stepped forward, not into the chapel, not yet, but close enough that its hand breached the water's skin, and its fingers were human, but wrong, remembered, and bitter. Hollow Glen was never abandoned, not in the way other towns fade, forgotten by road builders, swallowed by drought, erased by flood. No, it remained. It chose to remain, but what it remained as, that was the question left to those who passed too close, too slow, and didn't forget fast enough. The chapel still stands, though no path leads to it. The orchard still breathes, though the fruit no longer falls, and if you walk the ridge at dusk, on the exact day the moon refuses to rise, you may hear the chimes, soft, metallic, uneven, marking not time but memory, not yours, theirs. They say the elderwood frame has rotted now, though no rot smells quite like that. They say the vat dried up, leaving only a brittle film that curls at the edges, like old skin. But they also say jugs keep appearing on thresholds miles away, uncorked, still warm, with a single breath inside. And if you dare to inhale, just once, you'll hear it. Not a voice, not at first, just a taste, sharp, thin, bitter. Then the remembering begins. Thank you for staying with us through this descent into the strange rites and slow unraveling of Hollow Glen. If this story unsettled you, good. Some truths were never meant to sit easy. Some memories prefer to steep in silence. Before you go, tell us, where are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you find a jug on your doorstep, don't open it, or do. Either way, it already knows your name. Subscribe for more. We'll be waiting. By the fall of 1838, the fields surrounding Hollow's Reach carried a scent no rain could cleanse. Low stone walls bordered the land like ribs, half swallowed by time and moss, enclosing what remained of the Hollingsworth property. The air there held a stillness that disturbed even the most seasoned travellers. No birds called above the orchard, no deer wandered near the well. The soil had been worked by one family for over 4 generations, yet not a single descendant remained to tend it. Locals whispered that the ground itself had become too accustomed to grief, too soaked in it. The farmhouse, once painted white, now slumped against itself like a kneeling man, its windows shuttered as if in prayer. When surveyors arrived that autumn to assess the property, they found nothing alive inside, but they did find candles, hundreds of them, placed in a perfect ring around the hearth, each burned down to the wick, and the smell of milk, sweet and sour, clung to the walls like breath. Before we go any further, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments below. The first Hollingsworth to settle the ridge was Elijah, a widower with 3 sons and a Bible scorched at the edges. He arrived in 1802, pulling a wagon with no horses, just the boys, and a rusted bell that hung from the side. It was said he rang it every hour on the hour for the first 7 days after their arrival. Though no one knew why, he built the house himself with stone and pine, laying the foundation over a natural spring the locals considered cursed. Elijah insisted the water was clean, blessed even, and poured it over his children's heads each morning as a ritual of protection. But the spring dried up within a year. What flowed after wasn't water. Neighbors who drank from it reported dreams of animals walking upright, their mouths sewn shut with reeds, and children crawling backwards through wheat fields. Elijah warned them not to speak of visions. Revelation, he said, was meant for the chosen, not the curious. By 1811, a second structure stood behind the main house, narrower, windowless, built from river stone. It was not a barn, though the townsfolk called it that to make conversation easier. Its single door was padlocked from the outside, and only Elijah carried the key. On Sundays he led his sons inside, and did not emerge until the moon had fully risen. No hymns were sung, no sermons were heard. But sometimes, if the wind pressed low, neighbors reported faint muttering, like a prayer chewed through gritted teeth. Elijah told the sheriff it was a place of silence and reflection. Yet no one was allowed near it, not even his eldest, Thomas, who once claimed he had heard someone else inside, breathing differently than the rest. Elijah beat the boy until his lips split, then laid him down at the door and poured cold milk into his mouth, while whispering, "Only what's holy can fill you again." Thomas never asked again. When the Reverend Ezekiel Finch came to Hollow's Reach in 1816, the townsfolk hoped he would put the Hollingsworths in line with the rest of the county. He wore grey linen and spoke softly, favouring parables over judgment. But Elijah didn't take to him. He never came to services. He never allowed his boys to be baptised in public. Instead, he offered the Reverend a meal, boiled oats and a white liquid in a stone bowl, and asked him to bless the family's private rites. Ezekiel declined. He returned shaken, speaking little of the visit, except to mention the children's eyes. "They don't blink," he said once. "Not even when you're pouring scripture over them." A month later, Reverend Finch stopped preaching altogether. He left a final sermon nailed to the chapel door, 12 pages written in perfect ink, though his hands had long since begun to tremble. The title read only, "The Mouth Remembers." He vanished that winter. His boots were later found beside the Hollingsworth spring. As the years passed, Elijah's sons grew tall but pale, their skin nearly translucent in the colder months. No one could say for certain where they went during the day, for they were never seen in town and never hired for labour. But sometimes, smoke would rise from the old chimney in the middle of summer, and travellers would report strange harmonies drifting down the hill, low, layered tones, not quite music, not quite human. The mother, whose name had long been forgotten, was said to have died during the journey to Hollow's Reach, though no one ever confirmed a burial. Yet several women in the nearby village swore they saw a figure in a black veil standing at the edge of the orchard at dusk, unmoving, her hands clasped over her belly as if waiting. When children asked about her, their mothers told them she was a warning, not a woman. "She's what happens when you pray with your eyes open," they said, and the children, wisely, never did. In 1823, a fire swept through the western ridge, after a lightning storm split an ash tree near the edge of the Hollingsworth property. The flames licked the grass like fingers, devouring everything in their path. But when it reached the farmstead, it stopped. Witnesses claimed the fire curved around the stone wall, as if repelled, leaving the orchard untouched. Even the wooden gate, bone dry from years of sun, remained whole. The sheriff called it a blessing. The town priest called it unnatural, but Elijah offered no comment. Instead, he walked the perimeter 3 times the following morning, scattering white powder into the soil, murmuring in a tongue that was not English. Afterward, he left 7 bowls of milk along the border, 1 for each day of creation, he said. The ground around those bowls grew nothing for decades. Not weed, not worm, just silence, and the faint impression of bare feet that faced inward. By the time Thomas, the eldest son, turned 28, his hands had begun to tremble without reason. He walked with a limp that no injury explained, and his voice, once deep and clear, became thin, almost childlike. When asked by a wandering surveyor what ailed him, Thomas replied that he was hollowing out, though he would not say from what. It was around this time that townspeople began finding strange bundles left on their doorsteps, pale cloth wrapped in twine, each containing a lock of hair and a small square of wood, etched with numbers. No 2 bundles were the same, and no one claimed them. The sheriff suspected the Hollingsworth boys, but had no proof. One farmer, upon unwrapping his parcel, discovered a tooth tucked inside, flat, human, and milk white. He buried it beneath his porch and moved away within the week. Before leaving, he said only this: "Whatever they're doing up there, it's not farming, and it's not done yet." In the spring of 1835, a child named Abigail Dawn wandered too close to the Hollingsworth orchard while chasing a lost ribbon. She was 7, fond of singing, and known to speak to her dolls as if they were parishioners. When she did not return by dusk, search parties formed. They found the ribbon snagged on a low branch at the orchard's edge, but no sign of Abigail. Her footprints, light and straight, led into the tree line, and never returned. For weeks her name was spoken in prayers and carved into the chapel pews. Then one night her mother heard a sound beneath their floorboards, humming. When the boards were lifted, they found nothing, only the smell of milk, strong and sudden, lingering in the dirt. Months later, a note was found nailed to the chapel door, written in a child's hand. It read, "She's full now. You don't have to look anymore." No one saw who placed it, but the handwriting matched a letter Abigail once wrote to Santa, still pinned to the family hearth. By early 1836, the Hollingsworth name was no longer spoken in public without a gesture, either a quick sign of the cross or a spit into the dirt. Children were taught to avoid the orchard, not out of fear, but reverence, the kind reserved for graveyards and altars too old to question. Stories shifted from whispers to warnings. It was said the trees had begun to bend inward, their branches forming a ring like clasped hands around the central clearing. No animals entered the grove, and no wind disturbed the leaves. One hunter, passing through at dusk, claimed to see a young man standing perfectly still among the trunks, wearing white robes stained at the hem. His face was blank, empty where the eyes should have been. The hunter fired his rifle out of instinct, but the figure remained. When he returned with others, there was no trace. Only a half-melted candle stood where the man had been, burning without flame. The town's midwife, Clara Bell, was the last outsider permitted to cross the Hollingsworth threshold. In the summer of 1836, she was summoned by a barefoot boy who appeared at her doorstep before dawn, holding a silver spoon and nothing else. Without speaking, he pointed to the hills. Clara followed. What she found inside the house, she never fully described. In her words, it was a birth, but not one I've ever been trained to catch. The child, if it was a child, did not cry. It pulsed. Its skin was pale blue, and its mouth opened wider than seemed possible, yet no sound emerged. Clara placed the infant in a basin of warm milk, as instructed, and left with her hands shaking. She burned her apron before re-entering her own home. Within a week, she left Hollow's Reach entirely. Her final words to the town doctor were written in a single line. "Whatever I helped bring forth, it was already waiting." The spoon the boy had carried was never returned. It had no reflection. Not long after Clara's departure, strange symbols began appearing carved into the trees along the Hollingsworth property. They weren't letters, though some bore resemblance to fractured scriptural glyphs. Crosses bent sideways, circles intersected by knives. The carvings bled sap in heavy drips, staining the bark in wide arcs, as though the trees themselves had been wounded. School children dared one another to run and touch the marks, but those who did developed high fevers and a persistent taste of iron in their mouths. One boy, Benjamin Marks, claimed he dreamt of a chapel built underground, where the pews were filled with mannequins dressed in white, their mouths sewn shut with thread. When his mother found him feverish and trembling, he whispered that he heard a voice from beneath the roots calling him by name. "But not my name now," he said. "My name from before." The fever broke, but Benjamin stopped speaking altogether, and at night, his breath smelled faintly of milk. In the early winter of 1836, a travelling tinsmith named Lowell Adaby stopped in Hollow's Reach, seeking shelter and trade. He'd never heard the Hollingsworth name and knew nothing of the orchard's reputation. On his second evening, he followed what he thought was a footpath through the hills and stumbled upon the property just after dusk. The house appeared unlit, yet thin lines of red glowed from beneath the shutters, and the air was thick with the smell of warmed sugar and earth. Curious, he approached the door and knocked. It opened without touch. Inside, the walls were lined with open Bibles, dozens of them, each with pages soaked through in milk, and turned to the Book of Lamentations. A man sat by the hearth, facing away, motionless. In his lap, a bundle swaddled in white cloth. When Lowell spoke, the man did not respond, but the bundle twitched. Something inside it began to hum, not quite a lullaby, but something older. Lowell fled, leaving behind his satchel and tools. He was later found wandering barefoot near the river, blind in one eye. He never again spoke of fire or family. That same December, parishioners at St. Lyle's Chapel, nearly 5 miles from the Hollingsworth farm, reported a series of strange occurrences during their Sunday service. The candles on the altar, though freshly trimmed, refused to stay lit. The organ produced only low groans, no matter the key struck, and in the middle of Reverend Caldwell's sermon, the front doors creaked open without wind, revealing nothing but frost. Some took it as a sign, others as a warning. After the service, a small bundle was discovered left on the front pew, pale cloth, tied in twine, containing a child's tooth and a piece of wood, with the number 11 scratched into it. Reverend Caldwell, trying to calm the congregation, insisted it was a prank. But that evening, as he walked the chapel grounds, he saw footprints in the snow, bare, small and freshly pressed, leading in a single line toward the orchard's direction. He followed them for nearly an hour, but they never veered, never paused. Eventually, they simply ended. Not at a tree, not at a fence, just stopped mid-stride, as if whoever had walked them had been lifted away. That same December, parishioners at St. Lyle's Chapel, nearly 5 miles from the Hollingsworth farm, reported a series of strange occurrences during their Sunday service. The candles on the altar, though freshly trimmed, refused to stay lit. The organ produced only low groans, no matter the key struck, and in the middle of Reverend Caldwell's sermon, the front doors creaked open without wind, revealing nothing but frost. Some took it as a sign, others as a warning. After the service, a small bundle was discovered left on the front pew, pale cloth, tied in twine, containing a child's tooth and a piece of wood with the number 11 scratched into it. Reverend Caldwell, trying to calm the congregation, insisted it was a prank. But that evening, as he walked the chapel grounds, he saw footprints in the snow, bare, small and freshly pressed, leading in a single line toward the orchard's direction. He followed them for nearly an hour, but they never veered, never paused. Eventually they simply ended, not at a tree, not at a fence, just stopped mid-stride, as if whoever had walked them had been lifted away. As spring approached, so did a shift in the land itself. Crops along the ridge began to warp. Potatoes grew hollow, corn twisted into shapes no farmer could recognize, and milk from neighboring cows curdled moments after milking. Farmers blamed the soil, but none would say aloud what the children had already whispered, that the orchard had begun to hum at night. Low and rhythmic, like breath drawn through teeth. Two sisters, Sarah and Eliza Wren, dared one another to sleep near the orchard's edge. At dawn only Sarah returned. Her hair had turned completely white. She would not speak for days. When she did, she asked only one question, again and again. Do you remember the name they gave you? Eliza was never found, but her nightdress was discovered weeks later in a nearby chapel, folded perfectly beneath the pulpit, still damp, with petals sewn into the hem. The petals were from trees that did not grow anywhere near Hollow's Reach. By midsummer of 1837, the orchard had become a place no one would pass, not even by accident. Birds circled above it without landing, and dogs refused to follow commands if it meant crossing into its shadow. The trees bore no fruit, yet their branches sagged under invisible weight. At night, pale glows were seen flickering between the trunks, small like candle flames, but cold in color. One evening, a carpenter named Joel Flint claimed to see a procession moving silently through the grove. He described figures robed in linen, each carrying a bowl. No faces could be seen, only hands, long, shaking, reverent. At the center of their path stood the same windowless building Elijah had built decades earlier. Its door was ajar. Joel watched them enter, one by one, until the last turned and looked directly at him. He swore its eyes were his own, not similar, his that night. Joel nailed every mirror in his home shut and left town the next morning. His home was later found abandoned, except for a note carved into the dining table. I cannot carry myself twice. When the summer waned and the harvest moon rose over Hollow's Reach, a sound was heard across the valley that no one could explain. A deep, resonant toll, like a bell submerged in soil. It came once every hour, always just past the minute, and always from the direction of the Hollingsworth land. The sound wasn't sharp like church bells, but muffled as though struck from within a box or beneath a blanket of earth. Some believed it was Elijah's old wagon bell, finally rung again. Others said it was not a bell at all, but a voice, one too large to belong to any throat. Whatever the case, sleep grew harder to find. Children woke with nosebleeds. Mothers swore they heard their infants speaking phrases in dreams they hadn't yet learned to form. One widow, bedridden for months, sat up suddenly at 2:01 a.m. and whispered, "It's beneath the milk now." She died before sunrise. Her tongue had turned white. That autumn, a letter arrived at the post station in Hollow's Reach, with no return address and no stamp. The envelope was yellowed and sealed with candle wax, marked only by a crude drawing of a spoon. Inside was a single sheet of parchment containing a name none in town recognized, Judah Hollingsworth, followed by the phrase, "He remembers even what you forget." The handwriting was uneven, as if written by multiple hands at once. The postmaster, unsure what to do, placed it in a drawer and locked it away. That night he heard scraping from the drawer, slow, deliberate, as if something inside was shifting. The next morning the paper was gone, though the drawer remained locked. A wet imprint of the message remained on the wood grain. From that day forward, the postmaster refused to touch incoming mail from the southern hills. "Let ghosts deliver their own," he said. No one challenged him, and no one ever spoke the name Judah aloud again. The county schoolhouse, a single-room structure with peeling clapboard and a rusted bell, had always stood just beyond the reach of the Hollingsworth property. In November of 1837, the schoolmistress, Eleanor Pace, began to notice strange alterations to her blackboard each morning. Though she cleaned it nightly, she'd return to find unfamiliar phrases written in fine, looping script, words not in any known language, but arranged in neat hymnal lines. The children, especially the younger ones, started humming during lessons. The melody was faint and unsettling, always the same, and none of them remembered learning it. One boy, Samuel Dunn, began drawing circles with lines inside them, over and over again, covering entire pages. When asked what it meant, he answered, "That's where the mouths go when they don't need teeth." Eleanor closed the school early for winter and left for her sister's home in the city. She never returned. Years later, her journal was found in the rafters. Every page after her final entry was blank, except for a single phrase written faintly at the bottom corner of the last page. Not all milk comes from cows. As winter crept in, the orchard's edges began to rot inward. The bark on the trees peeled away in long curling strips, revealing wood beneath that pulsed faintly under moonlight. The townsfolk no longer spoke of the Hollingsworths as people. They had become a season, a direction, a condition of the land. That field's gone full Hollingsworths, farmers would say when their soil soured. One night, a parish deacon named Jonathan Meyer made the climb alone to deliver a warning, some say a plea. He carried salt in his pockets and verses on his tongue, hoping scripture might part whatever veil had thickened over the land. He returned before dawn, barefoot and silent, his palms blistered in the shape of open eyes. He would not step into the church again. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the town daily for 12 years, tracing invisible lines with his fingers and muttering, "They kept her warm too long." No one ever asked who, but every Christmas Eve thereafter, someone found a single white glove left hanging on the chapel's back door. It was always wet, and it never froze. In the final weeks before the thaw of 1838, a travelling preacher named Brother Asa Grimley arrived in Hollow's Reach, claiming he had been called north by a dream of milk and mouths. He was tall, thin, and gaunt in the way only long prayers could make a man. He preached fire beneath his breath, and carried a battered hymnal he never opened. Upon learning of the Hollingsworth land, he requested an audience. No one offered to guide him. He made the journey alone, disappearing into the misted hills just before dusk. He returned 3 days later, soaked to the bone, but his clothes bore no mud or stain. He set up camp near the edge of town and spoke little, except to say, "They have rewritten the blessing, and it does not end with amen." Each night, he lit 13 candles in a perfect circle and recited names no one recognized. On the 14th night, the flames refused to catch. He packed his things and vanished before sunrise. His hymnal was left behind, its pages hollowed out. Inside sat a spoon, warm to the touch, heavy as bone. A few days after Brother Grimley's departure, the weather shifted without warning. Snow fell in sheets, heavy and soundless, muffling the town in a pale hush. But at Hollow's Reach, no snow settled. The orchard remained bare, untouched, as if it existed apart from season or sky. That night, the bell in St. Lyle's Chapel rang 13 times just after midnight, though no one had touched the rope. When the townspeople gathered the next morning, they found the sanctuary doors ajar. Upon the altar, laid with precision, was a folded baptismal gown still damp, with what smelled faintly of sweet milk. The cloth bore stitched initials, A.H., the same as Abigail Hollingsworth, Elijah's long-dead wife, whose name had not been spoken in years. The parish priest wept without knowing why. He closed the chapel for a week, and when he returned to reopen it, he found the floorboards beneath the altar, warped and lifting. Beneath them 13 spoons, each engraved with a different child's name. Some were names already buried in the parish record, others had not yet been born. By the end of March 1838, the air in Hollow's Reach had begun to taste of metal, iron heavy and thick, as if drawn from the lungs of something sleeping just beneath the soil. Farmers couldn't keep their tools from rusting, wells ran cloudy. Infants born in those weeks refused to cry until they were bathed, and when they did, their first sounds were not wails, but hums, soft and low, always in the same key. One mother claimed her baby opened its eyes and smiled before taking its first breath, as if remembering something. The midwife attending her fainted. Word spread quickly, and soon families began keeping bowls of salt water at their doorsteps, whispering old names over the surface. One morning, a man named Ellis Croyne woke to find every mirror in his home smeared with milk. In the center of each, a single word drawn by fingertip, return. That same day, he walked out of town without shoes or coat, humming a lullaby no one could place. His footprints led toward the orchard. They did not lead back. On the eve of Pentecost, a thunderless storm passed over Hollow's Reach. Black clouds spiraling without wind, as if spun by breath alone. Lightning flashed in patterns, striking not from sky to earth, but from ground upward into the air, forming silent trees of white fire that vanished without smoke. The townsfolk gathered in St. Lyle's to pray, though no words rose above a whisper. The chapel's windows dripped with condensation, though the air inside remained cold. At the stroke of midnight, every candle extinguished at once. In that stillness, a new sound began to rise from beneath the floorboards. Not footsteps, not voices, but a slow, wet stirring, like something being pulled from thick earth. Then came the chant, faint, childish, wrong. The priest fell to his knees, whispering the Nicene Creed in fractured Latin. When dawn came, no one spoke. They opened the doors and found 13 white cloths laid across the churchyard, each folded with care, each containing a spoon and a lock of hair. No one knew the names, but every family in town was missing at least one photograph. By the first week of April, 1838, silence had begun to behave differently across Hollow's Reach. It no longer descended like weather or absence. It clung, it pressed against the chest, dampened the floorboards, settled between the lips of mothers who no longer told bedtime stories. The orchard, once content to be a border of dread, had shifted into something fuller, something watching. It was no longer just the trees or the soil, but the air itself, sharpened and expectant. And when the silence broke, it did so not with sound, but with movement. A single white bowl appeared on the porch of every home in town, each filled precisely to the rim with warm milk. No note, no messenger, no hand to place them. The town woke to them on a Sunday, and by the time church bells rang, the milk had cooled, none spoiled, none spilled. The sheriff, a stout man named Elias Crewe, had for years refused to speak the Hollingsworth name in public, though his gaze always drifted toward the hills whenever strange things passed through. That morning, he walked into the chapel during prayer and removed his hat. "It's time," he said. "We finish what we ignored." He gathered a search party of 4 trusted men: Thomas Price, a war veteran and known rationalist; James Toller, a farmer who had lost 2 nieces to the orchard's border games; Wendell Glass, the undertaker; and Milton Reeves, who had once claimed to see his mother's reflection blink at him from the chapel font 3 days after her burial. They left just after sunrise, taking 3 horses and a small cart outfitted with ropes, salt, and lanterns. The men didn't speak as they rode. Their path twisted into the hills with unnatural ease, the road oddly dry, despite a full week of rain. Crows followed them as far as the old fence line, then stopped. No bird entered the orchard. By sundown, the horses returned without riders. One bore a blood-stained saddle and foam at the mouth, eyes white with panic. The second dragged an empty halter where a companion should have been. The third, Reeves, was untouched, except for a single wooden spoon tied to its mane with a strand of braided white hair. It was clean, still warm. The town gathered around the returned animals in stunned quiet. No one asked what happened. No one went searching. That night, the sheriff's wife, May, claimed she saw Elias standing in the orchard, just beyond the stone wall, barefoot, his shirt torn, his hands cupped, like he was offering something invisible to a congregation. No one else could see. She didn't call out. She only watched. And in the candlelight behind her, every mirror in their house had clouded over with a white film that would not wipe clean. In the reflection, May did not see herself. She saw a table, set for 5, with bowls that steamed. The following Sunday arrived with a hush that no bell could lift. The pews of St. Lyle's Chapel, half filled and half bracing, bore attention more suited to graveside sermons than worship. The hymns were sung low, each voice barely a murmur beneath the weight of what hadn't returned. Of the 5 men who had ridden into the orchard's shadow, not a single name was uttered in the prayers. They were not listed as dead. They were not listed at all. After the service, a gathering of clergy and elder parishioners met behind the pulpit to discuss a rededication, a cleansing rite meant to cut Hollow's Reach loose from whatever had anchored itself in its soil. They unfolded old maps, read from weathered scripture, even retrieved a sealed scroll once thought lost, tucked inside a locked box behind the altar. But no voice carried certainty, only the shape of desperation. The youngest among them, Elias Drew, barely ordained and barely 20, volunteered to carry a prayer bowl to the orchard and leave it at the edge. "Salted milk," he said, from the font, in a blessed vessel. The older men nodded, grateful to have a willing hand not yet fractured by history. He took the bowl, whispered a psalm, and stepped into the still light of afternoon. He did not return. That night, a soft knock came to the chapel doors just after midnight. No one opened them until morning. When they did, they found Elias's boots neatly placed on the steps, side by side, as if in prayer. His white collar, freshly laundered, had been nailed to the oak doorframe with a blackened iron spoon. The bowl was nowhere to be found. Where the boots stood, the wood beneath was soaked, not with rain or blood, but with milk that had turned sour under moonlight. The taste lingered in the air for days. Later that week, a quiet shift was noticed along the border of the Hollingsworth property. Thin wooden stakes, each no taller than a child's knee, had been driven into the earth in a near-perfect circle. Atop each one fluttered a scrap of fabric, some torn from dresses, others stitched from blankets. All of them bore stains, though not the red of blood. They were pale, grey-yellow, smelling faintly of skin and wet cotton, and one, near the northern edge, held nothing but a braid of fine blonde hair, knotted tight at the base, and still beaded with dew. The sheriff's wife, who had begun to speak less and listen more, swore she saw a figure crouched inside the orchard that evening, stirring something over a small flame, no larger than a cooking fire, no brighter than a bedside candle. But the smell of warming milk crept down the hill and into the town, curling through window cracks and keyholes, settling into pillows and cribs. No one opened their doors, and no one questioned whether the town had been marked. They already knew. By the time the May rains began, no one spoke of the Hollingsworth land as if it were simply cursed. That word cursed was too sharp, too final. What rested in that orchard was not punishment. It was process. It continued regardless of belief. It thrived in memory and forgetting alike. And now it had begun to pull at the seams of the town's days. Birth records went missing from the chapel ledger. The bell atop the schoolhouse rang even on Saturdays. One child, not yet 5, began responding to a name that was not her own. She wept whenever her mother called her Anna, insisting her name was Ruth. Not the first Ruth, she'd whisper. The next one. Her hands stayed cold, no matter how tightly she was held. She sang lullabies no one had taught her, and always in threes, 3 notes, 3 verses, 3 breaths. It was around then that a man named Chester Gable, once a travelling judge who'd settled quietly in Hollow's Reach, began digging in his own backyard. He did so without warning and without ceasing, every night by lantern light, never speaking to his wife, never eating more than a crust of bread. When asked why, he answered plainly, "I had a dream the orchard is not the only place they buried them." He unearthed nothing but rocks and mud, but on the 7th night, he uncovered a single wooden spoon. It bore a name burned into the handle, Naomi. His wife miscarried the next morning. She had not been pregnant. The chapel attempted to hold Pentecost service that month, though half the town stayed home behind shuttered windows. Those who did attend entered a sanctuary that felt somehow narrower. The air was damp with the scent of cloth left in a closed drawer, and the candles burned with a pale, sickly flame. At the final hymn, several voices dropped away mid-verse, not from fatigue, but confusion. The words on the page had changed. They looked the same, but each singer found themselves saying something different. Old family names, snippets of nursery prayers, fragments of dreams they'd long forgotten. The priest stopped the hymn abruptly, closing the book as the organ let out one long dissonant sigh, unplayed. That night, The chapel's crucifix was found inverted, not turned, but regrown. The wood grain had twisted in upon itself, reforming the figure of Christ upside down, arms extended not in surrender, but in offering. No one touched it. No one prayed. The next morning, bowls of milk appeared once again, but this time inside the homes. Not on porches, not outside doors. On kitchen tables, beside cribs, at bedside altars, still warm, still full, and always accompanied by a faint impression in the dust nearby, a handprint, small, smooth, pressed flat, as if waiting patiently to be held. June arrived with no sunrise. The light each morning came as a dim, colourless wash, neither dawn nor dusk, just a grey film that refused to warm the bones. The people of Hollow's Reach moved through it slowly, their breath curling from their mouths even in the midday haze. The air smelled faintly of milk left too long in the sun, not sour, but heavy, warm at the wrong moments. The orchard no longer beckoned or warned, it simply waited. Its stillness had matured into something ceremonial, as though the land itself had knelt. A hush fell over the town, not in mourning, but in anticipation. Each morning someone found something, a spoon in their coat pocket, a child's sock on the doorstep, damp with dew, a small bowl resting beside their bed, still warm, though no one had entered. Every item was placed gently. Every object bore the scent of skin and milk. It was on the 6th of June that the boy vanished. Jeremiah Clay, 6 years old, slight of frame and known for walking in his sleep, was found missing from his bed without a single blanket disturbed. The window was locked. The door bolted from the inside. His parents woke not to silence, but to the soft chime of something tapping in the hearth. There, placed gently among the old ash and stone, sat a steaming bowl of milk. Floating at its center was a strip of linen, frayed at the edge, bearing hand-stitched initials, E.H. His mother, Esther, recognized the thread. It had belonged to her grandmother, but her grandmother had died before Esther was born, and the linen had been buried with her, sewn into the lining of the burial gown as a final grace. The chapel bell rang 3 times that evening, slow, uneven, and without any hand to pull the rope. No one came to pray. No one opened their doors. That night, the air inside the church turned humid, as if breath had thickened the walls. The crucifix above the altar began to drip, not blood, not water, milk, thick, slow and sweet-smelling. It trickled down the feet of the nailed Christ and pooled onto the cloth below, soaking it through in a pale bloom. The Reverend, now reduced to silence during most daylight hours, simply folded the cloth and placed it into a box. He did not speak. He did not bless. He closed the lid and whispered, "It begins with bowls. It ends with mouths." At midnight, a soft knock came at 13 separate doors across the town. Each knock, gentle, each one singular. When the doors were opened, nothing stood beyond them. Only the impression of bare feet in the dirt, walking away, perfectly spaced, as if someone had stood and listened. As if the act of knocking had been enough. No one followed the prints. No one called out. The wind carried the faint scent of warmed milk and damp stone. The orchard did not glow. It breathed. The days that followed blurred into one another, like breath on cold glass. Clocks stopped marking time properly. Always a few minutes slow, or fast, or caught flickering between ticks, as though unsure which present they belonged to. Hollow's Reach no longer felt tethered. The sky brightened, but never cleared. The birds had long ceased to return. A woman named Thalia Bren, who kept the chapel's records and had never missed a single Sunday service in 18 years, was found kneeling in the orchard at dawn, her hands cupped in front of her chest. In them, 13 pebbles, each smooth and white, arranged in a perfect spiral. Her lips moved, but no sound came. When they carried her home, she left behind a line of footprints in the dew, barefoot, pointed inward. She could not explain how she had gotten there. She only asked, "Did I do the welcoming rite?" Inside the chapel, something had begun to rot beneath the floor. The deacons searched for a cause. Rats, mold, a burst pipe, but nothing revealed itself. The scent wasn't sharp like death, nor thick like mildew. It was faint and sweet, like milk forgotten in a warm room, and it clung to the lungs longer than it should. Hymnals began to warp at the corners. Scripture pages grew damp overnight. Someone reported hearing footsteps on the roof during midnight prayers, each step deliberate, circling. When they checked, nothing remained but a thin trail of white ash leading to the steeple's edge, and a single spoon dangling from the bell's pull rope. No one rang it that Sunday. They simply gathered, stood in silence, and left before dusk. Then, on the night of the new moon, the town's infants all woke crying at the same moment. 13 of them, from 13 homes. No thunder, no light, just the sound, high and identical, as if their voices had been tuned to match. Mothers swaddled and rocked, but the children would not settle until a bowl of milk was placed at each of their feet, not for drinking, just to sit in its warmth. When the crying ceased, every bowl was empty. No spill, no stains, just emptied, as if consumed without mouth or movement. In the days that followed, each of those children lost something small, a fingernail, a first tooth, a wisp of hair, nothing life-threatening, nothing loud, but enough to mark, enough to name. The mothers began pinning amulets of ash and salt to their children's cribs, but the pins would twist themselves sideways by morning. The fathers said nothing. They had begun digging shallow holes in their gardens at night. Not graves, not wells, just impressions, scooped by hand. Always 13, always facing the orchard, and still, the orchard remained untouched. No growth, no rot, just that tight eternal circle of trees, waiting, like a throat, like a cradle, like something learning to speak. By midsummer, the town's memory had turned soft at the edges, not in forgetfulness, but in shape. Dates no longer held, names repeated themselves, and entire conversations were recalled differently, by different mouths. One man claimed he had buried his mother 2 years prior, yet her name was freshly added to the chapel's prayer list, just that week. A woman insisted she'd never had a sister, though her attic held a trunk of letters signed in matching hand. Most did not question these shifts. They simply accepted them as part of living near the Hollingsworth line, like mildew in spring or drought in August. But deep beneath that quiet resignation, fear had begun to take on a new form. Not urgency, not resistance, obedience. When young Caleb Toller was found kneeling in the chapel garden, facing the orchard with his eyes rolled upward and his mouth filled with soil, no one was surprised. They rinsed his face gently, wrapped him in wool, and placed him beside the altar, while the Reverend wept into his hands. Caleb slept for 2 days. When he woke, he would only say, "I saw the other spoons." He would not say how many, nor where they were, but he drew the same symbol over and over again on the church floor, a circle of 13 dots, encircled by a single open mouth. And inside that mouth, one small, unmarked bowl. The townspeople began keeping watch over one another, not out of care, but in quiet surveillance. Men who once broke bread at shared tables now eyed each other's children with suspicion. Every face began to carry a question: who would be next? Who had been offered? And who had asked? Then came the white night. The sky remained pale from dusk to dawn, without moon or star, a smooth glowing veil that lit the town like a lantern behind skin. No one slept. The animals did not stir, and in every home, something knocked once from inside the walls. Just once, then silence. The next morning, all the town's windows bore the same mark in their condensation, a single open palm, pressed perfectly from the inside, as if the house had breathed. At the edge of the orchard, 13 new stakes had been driven into the soil. These bore no fabric, no braid, only teeth. Each one held a single milk tooth, polished to a shine, balanced carefully on the tip of the stake like an offering. And beneath them, pressed into the soil by a barefoot heel, was a message, not carved, not painted, just impressed into the earth, as though whispered into dirt. He remembers even what we bury. The trees stood silent. The bowls remained warm, and no one dared to ask what year it was anymore. The orchard had begun to keep its own time. By the first chill of October 1838, Hollow's Reach had grown quiet in a way that no scripture could comfort. Not dead, not abandoned, just hushed, as if the town itself had bowed its head and forgotten how to lift it. Smoke still curled from chimneys. Lamps were still lit, bread was still baked. But something in the gestures had faded. The weight of survival had become ceremonial. Children were fed without being spoken to. Prayers were whispered without names. And across every doorstep, bowls were kept upright and clean, even if unused. The orchard had not moved. It had not spread. But the people now lived around it, the way a body learns to live around a buried splinter, favoring one side, flinching in sleep, waking with the sense that something long ago pierced them and never truly left. No one knew who lived on the Hollingsworth land anymore, if they were bodies or shadows, if they were names or echoes. The trees bore strips of cloth, now, white, weather-stained, all tied at the same height, swaying in wind no one else felt. Sometimes, at dusk, a pale glow flickered behind the branches. Not fire, not lamp, just a shimmer, like breath caught in a jar. It came and went, and no one followed it. That month, a baby girl was born to Miriam Dawn, a widow whose husband had vanished during the last planting season. The child entered the world without a cry. She opened her mouth, but gave no sound, only a low, sustained hum, even in sleep. Miriam named her Mercy. The midwife said the name before Miriam could speak it, and no one knew how. They baptized the child in salt water drawn from the well, though it hadn't reflected in nearly 6 months. When the water touched the girl's skin, it turned white for a moment, like milk, then cleared. The bowl it was poured from was placed on the chapel's stone floor, and left there. No one dared move it. It never emptied. It never spoiled. Mercy would not look into mirrors. She would not blink, but she smiled, always whenever the wind changed direction. Later that week, the townspeople found that no candles would hold flame after dusk. Wicks burned bright for only a moment, then choked and hissed themselves dead. Lamps flickered blue. Hearths took longer to catch. Heat refused to settle in homes that once held it without effort. It was not cold, but it was not warmth either. The kind of temperature a cellar keeps even when sealed. People began placing their hands against the walls, checking for breath. No one admitted why. And every morning, just before the first cock's crow, the chapel organ released one low note without being touched. Always the same pitch. Always the same length. Just enough to wake the mothers. Just enough to remind the town of rhythm, of hunger, of sound that asks for nothing but silence in return. When the frost finally came, it did not cling to the orchard. Every rooftop in Hollow's Reach wore a silver veil. Every fence post cracked under the thin weight of ice. But not the trees. The branches held no shimmer. The ground beneath them remained soft, warm, breathing. A visiting peddler from the next county stopped at the chapel to trade buttons and salted meat. He spoke kindly. He laughed easily. But when he asked for the road north, no one answered. They only stared. He tried again. "There's no path that way," one woman finally said, gesturing vaguely behind him. "Just old fields." He nodded, confused, and did not stay the night. He was found the next morning standing in the center of the orchard, barefoot, weeping. His cart was upright. His horse was gone. In his hands, he held a single bowl of milk, unspilled, unshaken, untouched. When asked why he'd entered, he replied, "She asked." And she said, "I already had." The townsfolk left him there. He did not resist. Inside the chapel, the pews had begun to warp, not from weather, but from something quieter. Sorrow turned structural. The floorboards buckled in a wide ring around the altar, and the stained glass had begun to lose color, not fade, but drain. The blues went first, then the golds. The figures of the saints grew fainter with each passing week, as if their stories were being rewritten by something unscripted. In place of their faces came soft impressions, hands cupped together, lips closed, eyes shut, not in prayer, in silence. During a stormless night, a 13th candle appeared on the chapel altar. It was unlit and unmarked, identical to the 12 that had once burned weekly. No one claimed to place it there. No one saw who entered. The Reverend, whose voice had thinned to barely a whisper in recent months, reached for it with trembling fingers. As he touched the wax, his breath caught, and he sat down heavily in the front pew. He did not speak again, that day. That evening, 13 bowls were arranged around the altar. They had not been carried. They had been placed. None of them matched. None of them rattled when moved. One was still warm. All were full, and still. The orchard waited. Its cloth-strung branches no longer swayed. They hung still and low, as if listening for footsteps. And from the center of the grove, where no path had ever been cleared, a sound began to rise. Not music, not chant, but the memory of language, like something relearning the shape of its voice. Each syllable came slow and wet, drawn up through soil and root and wood. Not yet words, but soon, soon, the orchard would speak, and Hollow's Reach, already silent, already bent, already obedient, would not answer. It would only listen. It had been listening for generations. It had never stopped. On the final Sunday before winter, the chapel bell rang without hands, just once, low, slow, and dry. The sound drifted not through the air, but into it, like something whispered directly into wood. No one gathered. The service had not been called, nor had it been needed for months. Faith in Hollow's Reach no longer moved in sermons or scripture. It moved in arrangement, of spoons, of bowls, of silence, and now of children. That morning, 13 were missing. Not vanished in the way of smoke or shadow, but absent as if excused, beds made, clothes folded, windows locked from the inside. Parents rose and knew before checking. The town did not shout, it did not search, it waited, and in that waiting, every hearth lit itself. One flame per house, lit in complete stillness, without kindling or match, just presence. The milk bowls, placed at each child's bedside, were found empty, perfectly clean, still warm. Later that day, the orchard changed. The cloths tied to the branches turned upward, every single one pointing not in dance or wind, but in decision. The bark darkened along the southern edge, and a ring of small depressions formed in the earth around its center, barefoot impressions, deep and still wet, though the soil was dry. The impression of movement, preserved like breath caught between words, and from the center rose the sound again, stronger now, the language forming vowels, long and slow, born from root and rot, and ritual. It spoke not in commands, but remembrance, and the town, already shaped by memory, bent its head to listen. At dusk, the Reverend emerged from the chapel alone. His cassock was wet, though it had not rained. He carried no book, no candle, no cross, just a wooden bowl, dry and dark, engraved with a single word no one could read. He walked to the orchard's edge, and sat beside the first tree, placing the bowl at his feet. Then he wept, not with sound, but with stillness, the kind of weeping that sinks into the spine. Behind him, the church windows pulsed once with pale light, then darkened. The next morning, Hollow's Reach awoke to find their names rewritten. Birth records, marriage logs, even grave markers, each bore slight variations, small enough to excuse, large enough to notice. Samuel became Simeon, Ruth became Ruther, Esther was now written Astra. The words had curved toward a different shape, a different lineage, and the ink in each book was damp, as though freshly written, as though just now remembered. In the final hours of evening, a wind passed through town that moved nothing, no leaves, no curtains, no grass, but every door, regardless of lock or hinge, stood open by morning, and each home smelled faintly of linen and milk. The orchard did not grow, the orchard did not bloom, the orchard waited, and the town, emptied of time, knelt without knowing. One spoon left on every doorstep, one name carved inside each bowl, one word rising in every dream, again. The orchard still stands, not as ruin, not as relic, but as rhythm, a breathing held just beneath the surface of Hollow's reach, quiet, warm, and waiting. The cloths tied to its branches no longer flutter. They hang still as tongues behind closed teeth. The soil beneath the trees has stopped accepting footprints, not because no one enters, but because it remembers too well. It has learned to smooth over what passes through, to keep the rhythm undisturbed, to bury the breath and preserve only the bowl. No one speaks the Hollingsworth name now, not from fear, not from forgetting, but because the town itself has absorbed it, into its doors, into its fields, into the soft creak of stairwells at night, into the milk that sometimes warms without fire, into the spoons that appear without sound, into the children who hum when they sleep, and always in threes. Hollow's Reach no longer holds services. The chapel remains unlocked, but no hands open its door, and still, each Sabbath, the organ sighs once just after dawn. No one plays, no one listens, yet every candle inside burns low by noon, their wax melted into soft spirals along the floor. If you were to walk there now, if your feet found the road that curves and forgets, you might hear it. That soft breath beneath the trees, that hum beneath the soil. You might see 13 bowls resting in the grass, filled just to the brim, perfectly still. And if you were to kneel, as they did, you might understand. It was never a curse. It was never a punishment. It was a table. And you've just arrived in time for the next setting. Sleep well. And if the bowl appears by your bed tonight, don't spill it. Someone is thirsty, and they remember everything. In the autumn of 1861, when the harvest moon rose over Carrow Hollow, Miriam Candle was seen for the last time crossing the old footbridge with a lantern cupped in her hands. She had wrapped her daughters, Mercy and Temperance, in quilts stitched from the fabric of her wedding dress, though no record remained of any marriage. The bridge swayed under her steps, the lantern flame bowing low, as if to greet the river below. By morning the quilts were found folded neatly on the far bank, still warm to the touch, and the lantern sat extinguished between them. No one ever found Miriam, but the sisters emerged from the tree line hours later, their faces streaked with soot, their hands stained the colour of tallow. When asked where they had gone, they only lifted their palms, as if showing a wound too fresh to name. Before we go any further, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it? As you hear this story unfold, let us know down in the comments. By the first frost, the twins had been taken in by Reverend Fitch, whose rectory stood apart from the village, hemmed by blackthorn and briar. He claimed the sisters seldom spoke, and when they did, their voices were so alike it seemed the words came from a single mouth. At night, he sometimes heard the hush of their bare feet passing his door, the soft click of the latch to the chapel hall. Once he rose to follow them, but the hall was empty, save for 2 taper candles guttering in iron sconces, their flames bending toward the altar, as though drawn by a breath no living lungs had issued. In the morning, he found the sisters kneeling in the orchard, their skirts soaked through with dew, their palms pressed flat against the frozen soil. As winter settled over the hollow, the congregation whispered that the Candle sisters were not merely orphans but vessels. Some claimed their mother had been seen long after her disappearance, drifting between the trees in a gown of smoke, her face a flickering hollow where eyes should have been. Others swore that on certain nights the rectory windows glowed red as coals, and if you dared to look in, you would find the sisters seated side by side, each holding a candle that burned without consuming the wick. No one could say what prayers they offered, or what presents answered, only that when dawn came, the air tasted of singed wool and old sorrow. In January, Reverend Fitch recorded a peculiar event in the parish ledger. He had risen before dawn to stoke the chapel stove, and found the nave filled with a scent like beeswax, turned rancid. On every pew, small drifts of pale ash had gathered, as if an unseen hand had dusted the wood with the remnants of something once alive. At the altar rail, 2 candle stubs stood upright, melted nearly to the base. Though the wicks had blackened, he swore a thin curl of smoke still rose from them, winding toward the rafters. He could not say how the sisters had come to leave such traces, or why the sight of those gutted candles made his heart lurch with something too close to pity. Later that week, a seamstress named Clara Voss came to deliver mended garments. She found the rectory door ajar and stepped inside without knocking. The hush within struck her first, a hush so complete it seemed to drink up the noise of her own breath. She called out, but no answer came. Then she saw them, the Candle sisters standing in the corridor, their hands clasped around the same candle, wax streaming over their knuckles and dripping onto the floorboards in slow, milky rivulets. Their faces were turned to her, but their eyes remained fixed on the flame, as though it alone possessed the right to judge her intrusion. She backed out into the yard and did not return. February brought a thaw, but the orchard remained crusted with frost. The trees furred in a strange silver that no sun could banish. Children who dared to play near the fence said they heard humming beneath the soil, a thin, wavering note that seemed to rise from the roots themselves. Some claimed the sisters were seen at dusk, moving between the rows in matching grey dresses, each carrying a candle held aloft, as if lighting the way for something that crept just behind them. When the last child ran home sobbing, the villagers agreed to keep their distance. No one wished to test what patience the sisters might have for the curious. On the final Sunday before Lent, Reverend Fitch gathered his courage and asked the sisters to sit with him in the chapel. He wished, he said, to understand what burden they carried, to offer whatever comfort a man of God could provide. But they only inclined their heads and began to speak in tandem, a quiet litany in a language he did not recognize, the syllables soft and flaring like embers. When the last word fell away, they lifted the candle between them and pinched out the flame. The darkness that followed was so sudden, so complete, that he felt for a moment he had been struck blind. When he dared to open his eyes, they were gone. If you find yourself passing through Carrow Hollow when the first snows come, you may glimpse them still, the sisters moving side by side along the orchard's edge, their hands joined by a single flickering taper. Should you feel the warmth of that flame brushing your cheek, do not linger. Some stories are not meant to be examined in daylight. Some prayers are better left unspoken, lest they take shape in the hush between breaths and set their roots in your heart. Walk on and do not look back. The Candle sisters will find another to bear witness. With the thaw came rumours that the Candle sisters no longer required the shelter of Reverend Fitch's rectory. A peddler from Dovetail claimed he saw them emerging from the hollow itself, their hair threaded with pale roots, their skirts damp as if they had risen from the earth, rather than walked across it. When asked what expression they wore, he could only shake his head. They looked as though they'd just been told a secret, he said, and it was burning them alive from the inside out. He never returned to Carrow Hollow, nor did he speak the sisters' names again. By March, the parish began to receive letters bearing no return address. Parchment sheets folded, once and sealed with a smear of tallow instead of wax. Each held a single line written in a cramped, angular hand. "We are becoming what she asked of us." No one could say who she was, though many guessed the reference was to Miriam Candle, whose absence had grown more vivid than any presence. The Reverend read each message aloud to the vestry, but no consensus was reached. When he tried to burn them in the chapel stove, the pages would not catch. They only blackened at the edges, curling inward like leaves too damp to surrender to flame. That Lent was marked by a season of sudden fires. A stable went up in the night, taking 2 mares and the harness maker's boy, who had slept in the loft. A shed behind the schoolhouse smouldered into nothing, leaving only a scorched patch of earth in the shape of a perfect circle. Some insisted the Candle sisters had been seen nearby, their faces calm and pale in the glow. Others swore it was simply misfortune, the work of a lantern knocked from a nail or a chimney, neglected too long. But the rector's wife confessed, in a whisper she regretted as soon as it left her mouth, that she had dreamed of two candles walking through the fields, moving with the slow certainty of a funeral procession. One evening, a farmer named Ellis Wright found himself drawn past the orchard fence. Though he had promised his wife he would never again go near the place, he brought with him a tin lantern and a jar of oil, telling himself he meant only to see whether the trees had begun to bud. But when he reached the farthest row, he saw the sisters standing beneath an old pear tree, their hands clasped around a taper, so slender it seemed a mere suggestion of a candle. The flame guttered, then rose, and in its light he thought he saw a third figure kneeling at their feet, her head bowed as if in prayer. He ran before he could be certain what he had witnessed. The following morning, Ellis tried to speak of what he had seen, but his voice faltered each time he approached the memory. He took to writing instead, small scraps of testimony he left on the chapel steps, in hopes the Reverend might make sense of them. In one note, he described the way the sister's candle flame bent toward the kneeling figure, casting a halo that pulsed like a heartbeat. In another, he claimed he heard a voice beneath the humming of the orchard, a woman's voice, reciting a name he could not bear to repeat. When the Reverend gathered the scraps, he found them damp with oil, the ink swimming across the page as though unwilling to be preserved. April brought the first true warmth of spring, but the hollow remained stubbornly cold. A frost persisted around the rectory, curling the grass into brittle curls that snapped beneath a boot heel. Children who ventured near returned with hands red and raw, claiming the air smelled of something sweet gone rotten. It was during this thaw that the Candle sisters were seen standing before the chapel door, their hair unbound and heavy with dew. They knocked only once before slipping inside. When the sexton arrived at dawn, he found the nave filled with melted tallow, the pews slick and glistening, as though the walls themselves had wept in the night. That Sunday no sermon was delivered. The congregation sat in uneasy silence, their eyes fixed on the empty space before the altar rail, where the sisters had stood. A single candle had been left behind, burned nearly to the base. Its flame rose steady and bright, undisturbed by any draught. No one dared move to extinguish it. When the bells tolled the hour, the flame flickered once and went out on its own, leaving behind the scent of singed linen, and a hush so profound it seemed to echo against the walls. If you should ever find yourself crossing Carrow Hollow, when the wind turns cold and the orchard sleeps under its veil of frost, remember that some spirits do not depart in smoke or ash. Some remain, steady as a flame cupped in a child's hand, and if you glimpse the Candle sisters moving through the rows, their faces turned toward a fire only they can see, do not call out to them, do not follow, for those who bear witness to their vigil are said to carry the ember of it forever, a small heat that never cools, no matter how far they flee. By midsummer, the rectory stood empty. Reverend Fitch had departed without notice, leaving behind only his Bible and a ledger whose last entry read simply, "They have been patient." No one knew where he had gone, though some believed he had followed the sisters into the orchard, seeking to understand what compels a flame to burn without end. The vestry convened in his absence, debating whether to board up the chapel, but every time they tried to nail the doors shut, the boards split down the grain, as if refusing to seal away whatever had made its dwelling there. Eventually, they left the doors ajar. That August, a woman from the neighbouring township of Winslow arrived in Carrow Hollow with her infant son. She claimed to have been led there by a dream of two girls who carried light in their cupped hands, light so bright it seared the darkness from her heart. She found the chapel without difficulty, though no path led to its steps. Inside, the air was thick with the sweetness of melted wax. She laid her son on the front pew and whispered her petition to the empty nave, her words soft as the brushing of moth wings. When she turned to lift the child again, she found him asleep, his tiny fist wrapped around a stub of candle no hand had placed there. In the weeks that followed, more pilgrims came. Some arrived at dusk, others near dawn, all drawn by the same quiet compulsion. They carried tokens, strips of cloth, locks of hair, small jars of honey, and left them on the chapel floor in humble tribute. Each swore that as they stepped back into the daylight, they felt a warmth spreading through their chests, a comfort unearned and inexplicable. But there were others who came not to offer thanks, but to challenge the legend. A pair of men, armed with lanterns and iron rods, forced the chapel doors wide and strode inside, declaring they would prove the sisters were no more than rumor. At sunrise, the sexton found the doors swinging gently in the breeze. The men were never seen again. September brought rains that flooded the orchard, yet the frost clung stubbornly to each tree. Beneath the standing water, pale blossoms drifted like drowned moths. Children peered through the fence and claimed they saw the sisters kneeling just beneath the surface, their hair waving in the current, their hands cradling a candle that burned blue as a star. A fisherman passing through found this tale so unsettling, he refused to cross the hollow at all, choosing instead a longer road that wound through the hills. He later confessed that each time he shut his eyes, he saw the candle's reflection glimmering on the water, and he feared that if he looked too long, he would see his own face there, waiting. By the Feast of All Souls, the orchard had dried to a cracked plain, the trees bare as old bones. The vestry gathered once more to decide what should be done, and at last they resolved to consecrate the chapel anew, hoping a blessing might sever whatever bond kept the Candle Sisters tethered to that place. The curate led the procession, carrying a brass censer whose smoke billowed in soft grey coils. But when he stepped into the nave, he found it already filled with light. Hundreds of candles burning on every pew, each flame steady and bright. The congregation stood frozen on the threshold, unable to cross into that radiant hush. In the end, they turned and left the chapel as they had found it. As winter returned, so too did the hush. No more pilgrims came. No more letters arrived. The hollow lay under snow, so deep it muffled even the memory of footsteps. And yet some nights, a soft glow could be seen through the chapel windows, moving from pew to pew in patient ceremony. Those who dared watch claimed the light belonged to two figures, their faces pale and calm, their hands joined around a single taper. Whether they prayed or waited, or simply remembered, no one could say. But the sight of them inspired a quiet dread, the certainty that some stories do not end when the last page is turned. If you stand at the edge of Carrow Hollow, when the moon is full, you may see the orchard silvered in frost, the chapel crouched beneath its drift of snow. You may feel the hush gather in your throat, a hush that tastes of beeswax and old sorrow. Should you glimpse the Candle Sisters moving through that hush, their faces serene as they bear their small flame, do not call to them. Do not step across the threshold, for those who cross into that circle of light are said to be changed, their hearts smouldering with a heat that no prayer can cool. And so their vigil continues. Two sisters bound not by blood alone, but by the flame that claimed them and the hush that followed. If you find yourself wandering that road, if the chapel rises against the night like a memory you cannot shake, remember this: not every light is meant to guide you home. Some burn only to remind you that darkness has its own devotion, its own quiet congregation, and some candles once lit can never be snuffed out. The winter that followed was remembered as the longest in living memory. Snow fell in drifts that buried the hedgerows, sealed doorways, and bowed the chapel roof beneath its weight. For weeks at a time, the road to Carrow Hollow vanished beneath a white so featureless. It became a kind of blindness, a blankness that swallowed even the memory of the world that had come before. And yet those who ventured near the chapel claimed the frost never touched its threshold. They described the sight in voices low with unease, two narrow trails of bare earth winding up to the door, as if footsteps had been made moments before, though no figure stood in the clearing. More troubling still was the faint glow that seeped through the warped boards of the nave, a glow too warm, too steady, to be the reflection of moonlight on snow. Those who lingered swore they heard a soft crackling, like wicks catching fire in the dark. A dairyman who had lost his way one night said he watched the chapel from behind a dry stone wall, unwilling to step closer. He saw the door drift inward, as if on a draught, though the air was utterly still, and from the gap spilled a line of candlelight so bright it gilded the snow in a path that stretched toward him. He claimed he smelled a sweetness, like honey left too long in a warm room, and in that hush he heard the faintest voices, two young girls reciting something in unison, their tones measured and soft, as though practicing a lesson no living teacher had assigned. He told himself he would look only once, to satisfy the hunger that had taken hold in his chest, the need to see what no other man had dared to name. But when he leaned out from the wall, the door swung wider, and in that moment he understood the cost of curiosity. Within the nave stood the Candle Sisters, precisely as the stories promised, hands joined around a single taper that burned so brightly it threw their shadows in every direction, tall and thin and wavering like reeds. Their faces were turned toward the flame, and though he could see the delicate planes of their cheeks,